Hello, everyone. I would have been lovely to meet you all in person, but I appreciate anyone who has an opportunity to listen to this recording. And considering this is an asynchronous keynote opportunity, I've kept my remarks brief and hope that we can take this offline for some more interaction. So as my title says, today we're going to be talking about rethinking our goals for open data. So first of all, who am I? Hello, everyone. My name is Daniella Lowenberg. And for those who I haven't had the opportunity to meet over the last 10 years, I've been involved in open data through various policy, infrastructure, and advocacy initiatives. I oversaw the product development most recently at Dryad, the open data repository, as well as I was the principal investigator for the Sloan Foundation funded Make Data Count initiative focused on the development of data metrics. I also co-founded the Force 11 and COPE Research Data Publishing Ethics Working Group. And before that, I was at PLOS Journals, where I implemented the data policy across the operational journals. But today I am here representing as an IPA at the Administration for Children and Families at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So in other words, what does that mean? It means that I am on loan from University of California, Office of the President, to ACF, where I'm focusing on open data strategies. And so like the little emblem here says, I am at OPRE, so the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation within ACF, where we focus on data and evidence to advance the well-being of children and families. And so today I'm hoping to weave similarities between experiences through academic research data and administrative data to speak kind of agnostically about where we are with open data. So to kick it off, let's start with the basics. And the first premise of this is data are important. Data are everywhere. Data are the oil. Data are monetized. They are going to keep being monetized. They are across every industry, and they are driving every industry. And the concepts of open data, data infrastructure, and data sharing are not limited to academic research. And data are creating jobs. So we've seen a rise in data science programs as well as divisions within organizations. University of Virginia here, who's notable, of course, because they created the School of Data Science. And they published this blog post that noted that they predict that there will be a 31% increase in jobs in data science, which would be the largest growth in jobs. And so I'm sure that even though this number is staggering, it's replicable across all other countries that are investing in this as well. And so I'm pointing this out really because it should have us thinking about how we're going to support the influx of data capacity. And of course, there's the policies. So there are research funder policies like the NIH with their upcoming data management and sharing policy, which goes into effect this coming January, as well as the recent OSTP Nelson memo, which focuses on data management and open data to be a priority. We've also been meeting the moment with how data have advanced treatments and have allowed us to track strains in the epidemiology of the COVID pandemic. And we also know that data are driving advances in the climate crisis, and increasingly we're seeing more and more requirements for data sharing across various climate fields because of this. In the United States, there's the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, which came into legislature in 2018. And that calls for creating data infrastructure across the agencies. So things like creating a chief data officer, like having metadata catalogs of data, like having public access plans for data. Okay, so premise one, we all agree data are important, the world are depending on it. We're trying to see everyone embracing this. But the next premise is yes, I'm here to talk about open data, but I believe that open and accessible are means to the end, or as my title says, open is not the goal for data. So taking a step back, what are data? Well, data are factual information. So that can be qualitative or quantitative. And I think that these are 2 points that are worth noting specifically about data, which is that data can and should be linked and don't need to be valuable just on their own. But data do each contribute unique information. So each data set is holding a unique body of information. But the idea of open data and putting in mandates and infrastructure for this is not new. Genomics researchers saw the need for this sharing, and they started building repositories in the 70s and 80s. The NCBI and NIH started launching these repositories in 1988. Ecology and evolutions researchers, as well as physics researchers, have long been sharing their data for decades, and their journals started to pick up on this as well and releasing policies. In the 2010s, we started to see more multidisciplinary, larger journals that began implementing open data policies. And we start to see funders have a slighter shift in this. And institutionally, we've been seeing as well a big emphasis on data management and data rights and retention. We've also just seen that this is not just in the US. Beyond, we are seeing in Japan, Europe, Denmark, Sweden, Germany, large national scale approaches to data sharing, as well as nationwide infrastructure and repository networks, where countries all over the world are prioritizing open data infrastructure. And this is just a snippet of that, but we're seeing policies and strategies for government as administrative data, as well as research data alike. And I raise this because I often hear at conferences that in the academics world, that folks refer to open data or data publishing as the new track or the innovative track, something that this is a new topic idea. But in the larger scheme of the world, it's not, and we're actually playing catch up to this. But in academic research, we are seeing that folks are moving beyond the concept of just talking about open, and there's been a shift to focus on both quality and the responsible handling of data. So of course, there's FAIR, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, which is the most popularized acronym, but it's also the least prescriptive, as it's a set of principles as opposed to workflows or guidelines. And so there are various disciplines that are looking into operationalizing FAIR and thinking about what it looks like across various data types. Recently, there was also the release of the CARE principles, thinking about how to sensitively handle Indigenous data. And last year, as I mentioned, Force 11 and COPE teamed up, and we released a working group with recommendations, policy text, and flowchart guidance on the handling of data ethics for repositories and publishers. Last year, this last year, 2022, the NIH announced the GREY initiative, the Generalist Repository Ecosystem, which focused on supporting multidisciplinary generalist repositories in a co-opetition. So that's to try and advance the practices for non-NCBI repositories, so non-disciplinary repository, like say gene sequencing, in opening up and managing their data. And this was important to come together to really support this new policy that's coming into play in January. But I want to make this very clear that open and accessible includes secure and restricted access. Repositories like Dataverse, ICPSR, institutional repositories, commercial entities on the industry side, and repositories at the agency level have invested more in making data available that require these access controls in secure environments. This is open data. Open does not have to mean that it's available to everyone, but it should mean that the metadata is. It should mean that the metadata are broadly available and findable. FAIR, CARE, trust, ethics, all of these principles and guidelines apply to data behind access controls. It's important to reiterate this point to not restrict our understanding of open data to being public use files. So yes, I'm trying to point out here that open and accessible are moving along swiftly and are intermediary points in trying to prove the value of data. But even with this history and advancements, the uptake and adoption of open data practices are not where they should be in academia. And much of this issue lies with the lack of compliance from funder and publisher policies. For instance, focusing solely on data availability statements instead of on data curation, proper data publishing, data citation. There's other barriers like the cost of quality curation at scale and the need for data management that accompanies that. And then there's also the need for large data infrastructure that doesn't yet exist. So it's important to recognize that everyone who's listening to this and everyone that we're talking to at this conference and beyond, that we have to invest in data infrastructure and to make workflows as easy as possible for researchers. And this differs broadly by discipline. So in a recent study by Tedder-Sue et al. That's linked here, they found that not only did the discipline of data affect open data practices, but so did the types of data within those disciplines. So everything is kind of varied right now, but this is really to say that it's happening more than we think. And those old school discussions of I'm going to get scooped, we've moved past that. The infrastructure has moved past that. So, okay, we've acknowledged that data are important. I've acknowledged that open and accessible are key features of data, but then in the grand scheme of things, why do we even want to push for open data? Why do we want this broad adoption? Well, broad adoption of open data is step one. Step two is embarking on a goal that data are routinely used as evidence. So let's talk about how we get there. So again, data are factual information. Evidence are data that are relevant to a question and are furnished proof that support a conclusion. So raw data are not inherently evidence. Data can be inaccurate, incomplete, irrelevant. And let's talk about an example of this. So looking at a weather dashboard here, dashboards provide data. We rely on them in many aspects of our work and personal lives, but it's not a given that these data are sufficient to support conclusions. So these raw data can be factual points, but they don't evidence a specific question. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that these data don't provide value. So data out there in the world existing, that's great. It's not enough. Data being open and accessible, important, but still not enough. Data archived in a repository with the citation, crucial, an absolute step that needs to happen and should really be what we're referring to when we say data are open. But data preserved in a repository don't indicate that the data are high quality, usable, or valuable. Having data in a repository with a citation allows for the community to assess, validate, and review the data, but this is still not enough. So the question is, why invest in hundreds of thousands of data sets being preserved and made available every year if they're not usable, and the cost of that infrastructure to do so? And the community discussion has often centered around success of policies, repositories, infrastructure, everything based on the number of data sets published or data statements simply noting that data are available. But the value and in return on investment lie in data usability. And without that, we're really just running at a loss. So how do we get from data to evidence? And the key to that is making data usable. So features and attributes of data reuse are going to vary across disciplines and data types, but broadly speaking, there's some key areas. The first is machine and readable and accessible file formats. And I don't mean that just for data files, but for the metadata as well. They need to be able to be executed on and run. When I refer to comprehensive metadata, I don't just mean the schema as well. I'm also thinking about a descriptive README and a data dictionary that allows for someone to understand all of the variables and how they were used. PIDs here, so persistent identifiers, we should be PIDifying everything, and that's for findability. So for funders, think about the Crossref Funder Registry. For institutions, the Research Organization Registry, or ROR. For people, ORCID, and for data sites, preferably DOIs. Having REST APIs for pushing and pulling data and also allowing for file previews is essential. And then lastly, I've put your data citation. So why would I put proper data citation for data reuse? And it's because attribution is key. And while we don't know if data citation is going to be the proper metric or indicator for all types of data or disciplines of data, the infrastructure is ready for folks to cite data. And I recommend checking out Haustein et al. For recent bibliometric advancements in data metrics, and you can find that through the Make Data Count website. So promoting data reuse, though, is not limited to technical infrastructure or those technical features that I was just referring to. Here are some examples of how libraries, research offices, funders, publishers, agencies, anyone who's listening to this can support data reuse. And so note that open data best practices means not simply tossing data over a wall into a repository and calling that a success, but investing in the usability of the data both as the submissions and as the secondary users of the data. So building up the capacity for researchers to use published data, mix it, link it, run it is as important as investing in folks publishing the data. I'm going to give a second here so that you can check out the rest of these that I've been talking over. So when data are usable, when they can be run, computed against, understood, then the scientific rigor can be assessed, the data can be trusted, and the data can be used with other sources. Importantly, the data can be developed as evidence. So if open and accessible are means to the end and reusable data principles are key to data becoming evidence, then evidence is the means to the beginning. So looking back at this slide, here's each point about what it is that we should be thinking about with open data, but really the North Star here is that data are routinely reused as evidence to drive discovery. The principles of scientific discovery, the US Evidence Act and Open Data Act, national and international initiatives globally are all reliant on the ideas of data-driven discovery and building trust to advance policy and well-being. Importantly, in the current state of the world, when data are trusted and used to build evidence and evidence is used to influence change, it helps to promote a positive feedback loop, reinforcing trust and driving discovery along the way. Across open data initiatives in academia, government, cross-sector, the conversation has been distracted about making data open, put it in a repository, full stop. And there's a prime opportunity for us to shift our thinking and prioritization to meet the infinite potential of using data as evidence. And this is reliant on shifting the conversation to data reuse. And it's happening. This isn't theoretical. Here in this great piece that was published as a blog, they point out examples from 3 different countries where this is happening. The first in Brazil, where they opened up income and expenses to expose corrupt practices. The second in New Zealand, when infrastructure was down after a natural disaster, they were able to use open data maps. And the third in Australia, when they used open data globally to build evidence for the cause of the death of swarms of bees, saving in the ag industry that relies on pollination. And so closing this out, I want to reinforce the importance of open reusable data, adding the word reuse into all open data conversations. I also want to press again that infrastructure does not mean technical always. It can include human capacity, data curation, controlling costs, both for technical infrastructure and for users. And data reuse is really focused on data quality. Of course, then I also put in rewarding, and rewarding includes investing in the bibliometric work and infrastructure to support data metrics. And last here is publicizing. So we should be building on the success, noting when data-driven discovery has really changed society, science, it's whatever that may be, and then building off of it so that we can continue to do so. And so I hope I've evidenced why open and accessible are key concepts in the longer journey of data being reused to build evidence, drive change, and discovery. So please reach out if you have any questions, and I hope to continue the conversation with you there. And thank you so much for your time.